a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be, if we met at midnight, in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. My wife and I had dinner with Julio and Marta the other day, the owners of the Organic Man Coffee Trike. We make plans to visit just about every month, but life, business, the world in general gets in the way. Running a small business is a lot of work. I told Julio that working for yourself, you have the worst boss in the world. You'll force yourself to do things that you would never make anyone else do. My cat's playing with my microphone. It turns out that my wife and I were their very first customers. We'd shown up before they'd even opened the shop. Now, they were fixing the place up, and we walked up and opened the door and wound up visiting for a couple hours. And of course, Julio had a pot of coffee going, so we had some and discovered he has the best coffee in the universe. If you'd like to try the best coffee in the universe, go to 4501 McPherson here in Laredo. If you're not in Laredo, you can go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop and buy some of the best coffee you'll ever taste. Don't take my word for it. Try it yourself. We don't usually get rain in Laredo, but we got a little the other night, and I lost a chunk of my roof. So yesterday I had to climb up on my roof and replace a bunch of shingles. I haven't done roof work in about 60 years. No, not that long, maybe about 40 years. But I haven't done roof work in a long time, and carrying shingles up a ladder and, oh, well, needless to say, I'm pretty well beat today. So if I sound a bit off, that's why. To add to the thing, I looked across at my neighbor's roof, and he was missing a couple shingles as well. Since his roof and my roof matched, I told him, hey, look, I've got a few shingles left over. I'll put them on your roof. And so I wound up fixing his as well. And now I'm paying for it. There are parts of my body that hurt that I forgot I had. So if I sound a bit off, that's why. Many years ago, I was listening to Art Bell on Coast to Coast AM. He had a guest, I forget his name, talking about Carlos Casteneda and his books. I was interested in the show, but listening while busy at work can be a bit of a hassle. You wind up missing a lot of information. Back then, you could get a copy of the show on a cassette. You had to send in a check and then wait 4 to 6 weeks for them to cash the check and then mail you a cassette. And if you were lucky, your cassette player wouldn't eat the thing for the first couple times you listened to it. Ah, the wonders of modern technology. Vic Hermanson has 2 podcasts going. Trailer Trash Terrors and a Paranormal Rundown. To find a subject to discuss, he has a list of several thousand subjects to go through. The computer randomly pulls out 5 subjects, and then him and the guests decide what subject they're going to discuss. JJ, David Griffith, and Father Birdsong, and they each will pick a subject and then they'll go into depth about it. The list is growing faster than they can talk about things. He sent me a copy one day for my perusal, and I go through it once in a while when I need a subject and I can't think of anything because I'm lost inside my own mind. Well, I found a subject that I have been thinking about for years, so let's talk about it. Carlos Castaneda was born December 25th, 1925, in Peru. To me, this would be a horrible day to be born. You don't get a birthday present and a Christmas present. You get one or the other. Maybe you'll get two presents, but they're not going to be as cool as if your birthday and Christmas were, like, say, 6 months apart instead of the same day. That's life. He went to college to study fine arts in Lima, Peru, and he hoped to make it as an artist here in the United States. Carlos was said to be a bit short, 5'5", maybe 5'6". He came to the United States in 1951. He worked a series of odd jobs, and he took classes at the Los Angeles Community College. He went to college to study philosophy, literature, creative writing. He also took classes in anthropology. Most students sign up for and hand over a handful of money only to discover that these subjects won't necessarily land them in a good career. Maybe they'll get a good job working in the fast food industry. You want fries with that? Let's face it, there just aren't a whole lot of jobs out there with philosophy or literature or creative writing open. So, but that's life. People think they're going to become millionaires by studying these things. You wind up working for minimum wage the rest of your life. Now, I understand that in some states, minimum wage is pretty well up there, which would be a good thing, except a lot of the minimum wage jobs have gone away. So people are right back where they started. When he would meet people, Carlos would tell them that he was actually from Brazil. He also said that he had served his time in the military. Why Brazil instead of Peru is anyone's guess. As for the military service, at the time, soldiers weren't much thought of. They were called a lot of bad names because of what was happening in Vietnam. Maybe it was one of those Me Too moments, but he did tell people that he'd been in the military, which is odd because there's no record of him in either the Peru or the Brazilian military. In December 1955, he met Damon Runyon's distant cousin, Margaret. Damon Runyon was born October 1880 in Manhattan, Kansas. He was a journalist and a short story writer, best known for his book Guys and Dolls, written in the regional slang that became his trademark. Margaret was about 4 years older than Carlos. She was single and interested in metaphysics. Metaphysics. I'm creating new words again. Metaphysics. They began to see a lot of each other, attending occasional classes, going to city college together, and spending hours talking about philosophy, mysticism, and spiritualism. 1959, Castaneda enrolled at UCLA, where he signed up for California ethnography and archaeology under Professor Clement Magan. One of the assignments was to interview an Indian. Well, the assignment was interview a Native American, but all the Indians I know, they say they're Indians. He got an A for his paper, in which he spoke to an unnamed Native American about the ceremonial use of Jimson weed. Castaneda was low on cash, and he soon had to drop out. He wound up working in a liquor store, and he drove a taxi. If he'd spent his time at a trade school, he wouldn't have had that issue. But then he wouldn't have become a millionaire either. Carlos took his U.S. citizenship in 1959, and that's when he started using the name Carlos Castaneda all the time. One day, with a very little planning, him and Margaret went to Tijuana and they got married. The certificate, dated January 27th, 1960, shows his name as Carlos Aranja Castaneda. They stayed together for about 6 months as man and wife before separating. The strange thing is, they remained on good terms, very good friends. They would see each other all the time. They just couldn't stand being married to each other. I've known a few folks like that. They would discover that they couldn't stand being married, but they still like the person. So they get a divorce and they wind up being best of friends. The marriage, Carlos and Margaret, was finally terminated in December 1973. While at UCLA, Castaneda kept the marriage a secret. He did sometimes show up on campus with a young boy who he never introduced to anyone as being his son. No one is certain if this was Castaneda's son or Margaret's from another marriage. All that free love could get a bit confusing when it comes to the aftermath. I hate to say it, but I knew a young woman many years ago who wasn't certain who the father of her son was. Free love is not necessarily free. Runyon and Castaneda would continue seeing each other, acting as if the marriage had never happened. They would meet up with groups of other students and spend the evening drinking and sometimes using other drugs. One night, a friend of theirs said that neither Buddha nor Jesus had ever written anything down. Their teachings had been recorded by their disciples, who could have changed things or simply made things up. Carlos decided that he would write his own book about his own thoughts. Runyon was working at the phone company at the time, and so he called his book Dial Operator, but he never finished it. He began to disappear for days at a time. He would tell Runyon that he was going to the desert, doing some soul searching. For the next 7 years, he worked on his manuscript that was to become the Teachings of Don Juan. The Teachings begins with a young man named Carlos being introduced to an Arizona to no, let me start over on that one. The Teachings begins with a young man named Carlos being introduced at an Arizona bus stop to Don Juan, an old Yaqui Indian who he is told is a very learned man when it comes to plants. Carlos tries to persuade the reluctant Don Juan to teach him about peyote. Eventually, he relents, allowing Carlos to ingest the sacred cactus buds. Carlos sees a transparent black dog, which Don Juan later tells him is Mescalito, a powerful supernatural being. His appearance is a sign that Carlos is the chosen one who has been picked to receive the teachings. Those who knew him said Carlos was a brilliant and a hilarious storyteller. Castaneda published a series of books that described his training in shamanism. He had been taught by the Yaqui man of knowledge known as Don Juan Matus. Under Don Juan's tutelage, Casteneda took peyote. Uh, the checkpoint that I used to work at used to be in Oilton, Texas, on 359. There was a woman who grew peyote just down the road from us. Indians would come through the point, and they had to show a certificate that allowed them to use the plant. A few folks would show up trying to gather some of their own. It's a controlled substance, and you can get arrested and thrown in jail for having it without that certificate. While using peyote, Carlos found that he could talk to coyotes. On occasion, he turned into a crow, and he was able to fly. Don Juan explained that Carlos wasn't actually doing any of these things. He was in an alternate reality where he had unusual powers. In this reality, if a person turned into a bird, they would have to be a very big bird. That's in this reality. Mass is the problem. If you weigh 150 pounds and you turn into a bird, you're going to have to be a 150-pound bird. As for being able to fly, well, if you don't know how to fly before taking peyote, you're not going to all of a sudden know how to fly. Drugs do not give you skills. Usually they dull them. Now, if the drug does send you into an alternate reality, then yes, you'll be able to do anything your mind can conceive. The whole thing of expanding your mind and making it better by partaking of drugs is a bad idea as far as I'm concerned. In the lead up to World War II, just about everyone in a position of power in Germany was taking drugs to enlighten themselves. I went to school in the 60s, and it seemed that even some of my teachers were using uh, things to expand their minds, to become more of whatever it was they thought they should be. Thinking is the best way to travel. That's a Moody Blues song from In Search of a Lost Chord album. The trouble with seeking enlightenment at the end of a pipe or the bottom of a glass is what you are learning just might be a bunch of drug-induced garbage. Those great thoughts can be just your imagination. Plus, once the drug is no longer enlightening you, what you have left is somewhat less enlightened. The teachings is largely a dialogue between Don Juan, the master, and Carlos, the student, punctuated by the ingestion of carefully prepared mixture of peyote, followed later by herbs and mushrooms. Carlos has strange experiences that, in spite of Don Juan's admonitions, he continues to think of as reality. In one instance, Casteneda is transported miles away in an instant. In another, they walk through walls and into some forbidden location. Afterwards, an argument ensues. Is there such a thing as an objective reality? Is reality just perceptions and different, equally valid ways of describing them? Towards the book's end, Carlos again encounters Mescalito, whom he now accepts as being a real creature, not a hallucination. In the teachings, Castaneda tries to follow the conventions of anthropology by appending a 50-page structural analysis in the end. His goal was to become a psychedelic scholar along the lines of Aldous Huxley. Aldous Leonard Huxley was a prolific writer with nearly 50 books to his credit. He worked in Hollywood as a screenplay writer. His best known book was Brave New World, which I never read, but I did see the movie. In early 1953, Huxley had his first experience with psychedelic drug mescaline. LSD was all the rage, and so he tried that as well. I knew way too many people who took a hit and never came back. They burned their brains out in one moment of indiscretion. Carlos became an advisor to Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert in their early 1960s research work with psychedelic drugs while at Harvard. For the few folks who don't read this sort of thing at the time, 1938 Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann accidentally developed the potent psychedelic LSD. The CIA began experimenting with the drug as a means of getting enemy agents to talk freely about their country's secrets. Congress passed the Controlled Substance Act in 1970, which classified LSD, along with psilocybin, MDMA, and peyote as Schedule 1 drugs, defined by the DEA as having no currently acceptable medical use and a high potential for abuse. Peyote is allowed to be used by members of certain Indian tribes. U.S. Code 1996A, a traditional Indian religious use of peyote, allows this. Carlos became disillusioned with Timothy Leary, who had mocked Casteneda at a party. He told his friends that Leary was too quick to hand out acid, not taking into consideration the person he was giving it to. Roger Heath, Sid Barrett, was an English singer, guitarist, and songwriter who co-founded the rock band Pink Floyd in 1965. Their early songs were a bit, well, no, they were a lot bizarre. Yes, I have them in my collection, and I listen to them a lot. Sid got into LSD. He was also diagnosed as being schizophrenic. What a combination! Maybe this is why he wrote such memorable music. Still, not a good idea to use drugs unless you need them to stay healthy or sane. A better living through chemical dependency. I say nay, nay. Castaneda spent months in 1966 in a psychiatric hospital at the UCLA Medical Center. Was he crazy, or did he drive himself over the edge by using substances best left unused? 1967, he took his manuscript to Professor Megan. Castaneda was disappointed when Megan told him it would work better as a trade book rather than a scholarly monograph. Following Megan's instructions, Castaneda took his manuscript to the University of California Press Office at the Powell Library, where he showed it to a Jim Quebec. The editor was impressed by the manuscript, but he doubted if the story was nonfiction. Castaneda had all of his friends contact the editor saying that the book was legit, and this led to it being published in 1968. The University of California Press may have still doubted the book was nonfiction, but they also knew that the counterculture was buying up any and all books with drug use as the theme or a subtheme. They pushed the book with advertising and book signing events. I wonder how many people ruined their lives after reading about the benefits to be found using psychedelics. Sales exceeded all expectations, and Quebec soon introduced Castaneda to Ned Brown, the agent whose clients included Jackie Collins. Brown put Castaneda in touch with Michael Korda, Simon & Schuster's new editor-in-chief. The first meeting is something out of a drug deal or the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. Corda was told to drive to a parking lot of a motel and wait. A car pulled in front of him, and the driver signaled Corda to come up and get in. Uh, Red flags everywhere with that one. But Corda was one of those folks who thought that bad things only happened to other people. A man he had never seen before was sitting in the driver's seat. This was Casteneda. Corda was lucky that this was the man he was there to see. Arrangements were made and Casteneda was signed on at Simon and Schuster Publishing. The next morning, Corda set about buying the rights to the teachings. Under his new editor's guidance, Casteneda published his next 3 books in quick succession. A Separate Reality, published in 1971, where Carlos returns to Mexico to give Don Juan a copy of his new book. Don Juan decides the gift is not what he wants, suggesting that he would use it for toilet paper. A new cycle of apprenticeship begins in which Don Juan tries to teach Carlos how to see. The third eye, also known as the seat of the soul, refers to the energy centered right between your eyebrows. Right there, if you're watching on YouTube, or the center of your forehead if you're not. Opening your third eye can lead to a profound sense of spiritual connection and a greater understanding of your place in the universe through meditation. Here in America, seeing is done by having a vision while in either a trance or by using certain substances. As Castaneda wrote, he began introducing new characters. Don Juan's friend and fellow sorcerer, Don Jinero, in A Separate Reality, and the 2 books that follow, A Journey to Ixtlan and Tales of Power, numerous new concepts are introduced, including becoming inaccessible, erasing personal history, and stopping the world. Castaneda wrote at one moment that Don Jinero is standing next to Carlos. At the very next moment, he's standing on top of a mountain, miles away. Don Juan uses unseen powers to help Carlos start his car, and he tries to show him how to be a warrior, a being who, like an enlightened Buddhist, has eliminated the ego, but who, in a more Nietzschean vein, knows that he is superior to all regular humans who are leading wasted, pointless lives. Don Juan also tries to teach Carlos how to enter the world of dreams, the separate reality, also referred to as the Nagual. A Nagual is a human who has the power to shapeshift into their animal counterpart. Wouldn't that be like a skinwalker? Nagualism is tied to the belief one can assess power and spiritual insight by connecting with the animal within. Castaneda shifted the word's meaning, making it stand not only for the separate reality, but also for shaman, like Don Juan and eventually Castaneda himself. In Journey to Ixtlan, Carlos starts a new round of apprenticeship. Don Juan tells him that they'll no longer be using drugs. These were only necessary when Carlos was a beginner. Many consider Ixtlan, which served as Castaneda's PhD thesis at UCLA, as his best book. It also made him a millionaire. Must have been nice. At the book's conclusion, Carlos takes the luminous coyote. He talks to the. Remember what I said about roofing yesterday? My body hurts. He isn't yet ready to enter the Nagual. There was to be another book, which means more money with more answers. Finally, at the end of Tales of Power, Don Juan and Don Inero take Carlos to the edge of a cliff. If he has the courage to leap, he'll at last be a full-fledged sorcerer. This time, Carlos doesn't turn back. He jumps off the edge. All four books were lauded as being the books that everyone should read. It was for the in crowd. There was so much praise being thrown around. I wonder if any of these folks actually ever read the books, or were they just getting into the hype? Things were being said like, these are essential lessons Don Juan has to teach. They are timeless lessons taught by the great sages of India. India? I think they're getting their locations crossed there. There were raves in the New York Times, Harper's, the Saturday Review. All the big magazines and newspapers were saying that these books were it. The folks doing all these reviews were getting Indian, a feather, not dot, confused with India Indians, or dot. In 1972, anthropologist Paul Reisman reviewed Casteneda's first three books in the New York Times Book Review, writing that, excuse me, Castaneda makes it clear that the teachings of Don Juan do tell us something of how the world really is. The really odd thing about this review was the original article had been written by Weston LeBert, one of the foremost authorities on Indian peyote ceremonies. It had pretty much declared that Castaneda's book as being pseudo-profound, deeply vulgar pseudo-ethnography. Could it be that the folks at the New York Times didn't want to look as if they were going against all the other news articles and heaping praise on these books? A lot of folks will say something is good just so they can fit in with those that they want to hang out with. I've never had that problem. If I think something is, well, excrement, I tend to say so. I get in a lot of trouble for doing so as well. It worries me when the massed efforts of the press or the publications or the talking heads all start saying the same thing. Movies that are simply the best ever are the movies that I will not be seeing. Books that that celebrities talk about will not be found on my shelves. This kind of advertising is called bandwagoning. It leads to the feeling of being left out of something. Everybody else is reading this book, and why not you? Well, I'm not everyone else. In the same year, everybody was falling all over themselves trying to outdo the others in their glowing reviews. Joyce Oates expressed bewilderment that a reviewer had accepted Castaneda's book as being nonfiction. The next year, Time published a cover story revealing that Castaneda may have lied extensively about his past, his place of birth being Peru and not Brazil. He told folks he'd been in the military, but there was no record of him in either Peru or Brazil. If you start out your career lying, it does not bode well for the rest of your story. Over the next decade, several researchers, mostly a prominent man named Richard DeMille, the son of the legendary director Cecil B. DeMille, worked tireless trying to prove that Castaneda's work was all a hoax. DeMille, who held a Ph.D. in psychology from USC, was something of a freelance intellectual. He said because he wasn't associated with a university, he could tell Castaneda's story straight. DeMille said, people in the academy wouldn't tell the truth. They would be embarrassed to the establishment. the UCLA professors who knew that the first book was a hoax from the start. These folks were in such a hurry to convince others you could enlighten yourself through drug use, they glommed on to Castaneda without worrying about what he was saying was not true. They wanted to show reality doesn't exist. It's all what people say it is that matters. Dr. DeMille's first expose, Castaneda's Journey, 1976, he pointed to numerous internal contradictions in Castaneda's field reports in the absence of convincing detail. During 9 years of collecting plants and hunting animals with Don Juan, Carlos learned not one Indian name for any plants or animals. The books were also filled with implausible details. For example, while incessantly sauntering across the sand in seasons when harsh conditions keep prudent persons away, Carlos and Don Juan go quite unmolested by pests that normally torment desert hikers. Ah, but what if this was because Don Juan, having such power as to keep the biting thingies away? I've heard and read about how some of Don Juan's magical abilities, things like bilocation and jumping from one place to another. Perhaps he used his magic to keep the biting critters off. DeMille wrote about some of the sayings that Don Juan uttered during his time with Castaneda. Things like, "We are number one. All others are number two or lower." No, that was actually the Sphinx from Mystery Men, the movie. Wes Studi was the best part of that movie. He was always saying deep things like, "He who questions training only trains himself at asking questions." Or, "When you can balance a tack hammer on your head, you will head off your foes with a balanced attack." And of course, "Do not go there, my son. When you doubt your powers, you give power to your doubts." Deep thoughts, all of them. If you haven't seen Mystery Men, like I said, Wes Studi, he was the best part of the show. DeMille said he had uncovered numerous instances of plagiarism. He said, "When Don Juan opens his mouth, the words of particular writers come out." His 1980 compilation, The Don Juan Papers, included a 47-page glossary of questions, quotations from Don Juan and their actual sources, ranging from Wittgenstein to C.S. Lewis, to papers in obscure anthropology journals. Now, I've known some people who were always quoting others. It was as if they never had an enlightened thought of their own. Now, I do quote others, usually things like, "Apart we are together," or, "Books may look like nothing more than words on a page, but they are actually an infinitely complex imaginotransference technology that translates odd inky squiggles into pictures inside your head." Try to remember that the next time you're at a party. That was a quote from Jasper Fforde. He is as entertaining as Terry Pratchett. I wonder if the two ever met. They're both on the same island, except one was from England and the other's Wales, but it would have been an interesting conversation between the two. If Don Juan was into reading books and had picked up sayings from others, this might have explained some of his sayings, but not 47 pages worth. The accumulation of so many quotes from other writers led DeMille to conclude that Carlos' adventures originated not in the Sonoran Desert, but in the library at UCLA. DeMille convinced many readers that Don Juan did not even exist. One of the best reasons was that the Yaqui didn't use peyote, and Don Juan was supposedly a Yaqui shaman, teaching the Yaqui way of knowledge. A few anthropologists were still in Casteneda's camp. They said he must have had some contact with a shaman. Perhaps he'd gotten some of the teachings confused. Maybe Don Juan was a mixture of several Indian medicine men. Following the publication of the teachings, thousands of pilgrims descended on Yaqui territory intent on taking a trip on peyote. When they discovered the Yaqui didn't use peyote, whoops, they were much perturbed. How can we get high without the magic cactus? News soon arrived that the Huichol people in southern Mexico did use peyote, and so the pilgrims all headed south. Once there, they did not endear themselves to the locals. Pretty much they became unwelcomed and they were asked to all leave. There is one account of a Huichol elder who was murdered by some high, stoned out of his mind student. After 1973, Castaneda never again responded publicly to criticism. Instead, he went into seclusion. Well, as far as the press was concerned, he was still all the rage at Hollywood parties, where drugs flowed like, well, drugs. When asked, not by the press, but his followers, why he was staying out of the limelight, Castaneda said that he was following orders from Don Juan. Castaneda, now in his late 40s, concealed his alternative family that he had started to form. The key members were three young women: Regine Thal, Marianne Simcoe, and Kathleen Pullman. Simcoe was pursuing a PhD in anthropology and was known around campus as Castaneda's new girlfriend. Through her, Castaneda met Thal, another anthropology PhD candidate, and Simcoe's friend. Nobody is too sure how Pullman entered the picture, but she was on the list as well. Castaneda purchased a compound on Pandora Avenue in Westwood. The women, soon to be known both in his group and in his books as the Witches, that's with a W, moved in. They eventually came to support identical short dyed blonde haircuts, similar to those later worn by Heaven's Gate cults. They also said they'd studied with Don Juan. There's no evidence that these women ever met with or studied under Don Juan. They may have been simply shoring up Carlos's story. In keeping with the philosophy of erasing personal history, they changed their names. Simcoe became Tasha Abelar. Thal became Florinda Donner Grau, nicknamed the Hummingbird because of her ceaseless energy. She had been born in Venezuela to German parents. Well, anyway, she also said that she was researching Yanomami Indians. Pullman was given the somewhat less glamorous name Carol Tiggs. Donner, Grau, and Abelard eventually published their own books on sorcery. The witches, along with Castaneda, maintained a tight veil of secrecy. They used numerous aliases, and they did not allow themselves to be photographed. Followers were told constantly changing stories about their background. Carlos began severing ties with folks from his past. He stopped seeing his former wife and his adopted son. Soon he was avoiding just about everybody from his past, including Don Juan. In his book, The Second Ring of Power, published 1977, readers learned that sometime between the leap into the abyss and the end of Tales of Power and the start of the second rings, Don Juan vanished. He was transformed into a ball of light and he entered the Nagual. Only after Casteneda's death did the real facts about their lives begin to emerge. This is largely due to work of three of his ex-followers. In the early 1990s, Richard Jennings, a Columbia Law graduate, was living in Los Angeles. He was an executive director of Hollywood Supports, a nonprofit group organized to fight discrimination against people with HIV. After reading an article in a magazine about a meeting with Casteneda, he became intrigued. Looking on the internet, Richard found his way to one of the semi-secret workshops being held around Los Angeles. He was soon invited to participate in Casteneda's Sunday sessions, exclusive classes for only select followers. From 1995 to 1998, he was deeply involved in the group, sometimes advising on legal matters. After Castaneda's death, he started a website, Sustained Action, for which he compiled meticulous research chronologies dating from 1947 to 1999 of the lives of Patricia Parton and the witches as well as Carlos himself. Another former insider was Amy Wallace. She was the author of 13 books, both fiction and nonfiction, including the Book of Lists, which she co-authored with her brother, David Welinsky, and their father, novelist Irving Wallace. She first met Castaneda in 1973 while she was still in high school. Her parents took her to a dinner party. Castaneda was there with Abelard, who then went under the name of Anne Marie Carter. They talked with Wallace about her boarding school. Many years later, Wallace became one of Castaneda's many lovers, which she later wrote about in her book, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Gabby Gutierrez had been a workshop attendee who hoped to join the inner circle. In 1996, she realized that she was being pushed out of the group. In an effort to find out why and what was going on, she and her husband began to shadow Castaneda. They would park across the street from his compound and film everybody coming and going. Because of their vigilance, or was it an obsession, they were able to get many photographs of Castaneda as he was aging. The couple would sneak over and they would go through the trash at night to find any incriminating papers. They found copies of marriage certificates, letters from fans and haters, credit card receipts that showed not just purchases but travel and interests. During the late 70s and early 80s, the Inside Group numbered about 24 members, mostly women. A pivotal event was the defection of Carol Teagues. Soon after joining, she had tried to run away from the group. She wound up attending California's acupuncture college. Then she married a fellow student and moved into the Pacific Palisades. Castaneda was able to entice her back into the group. He wrote in The Eagle's Gift, where he said that Teagues had vanished into infinity. She reappeared through a space-time portal in New Mexico. She then made her way to L.A., where they were joyously reunited when he found her on Santa Monica Boulevard. One of Castaneda's witches' tasks was to recruit new members. They were to find women with a combination of brains, beauty, and vulnerability. Initiation into the inner family often involved sleeping with Castaneda, who the witches all claimed in public was celibate. Aside from the three witches, other members were called warriors. Warriors, come out to play. I already did that one once. If you didn't see the movie Warriors, well, it's a movie you've got to see whether you like it or not. I found it entertaining. Saw it at the theater when it first came out. Anyway, they were told that this would allow them to become much more powerful. So they were told that they had to cut all ties with their past, including their family members. Was this to make them more powerful, or was this to make Castaneda's hold over them more powerful? The general opinion is about 100 new members came and went, all of whom were told what to do and how to do it. How many did this actually amount to? Nobody is quite sure because there aren't any actual records to be found. They were all destroyed. What I can't get my mind around is how intelligent people can be so stupid. I've seen it over and over as people with higher educations wind up under the boot heel of some crackpot who convinces them to do all kinds of insane things, and they do it. Initiates were told to tell their families to go to hell. Some were told it was a good idea to hit family members. Folks were so in need of belonging that they would do unacceptable things to prove that they could make good warriors. Maybe there's something wrong with what folks think of as a higher education. People would place their lives financially and emotionally in the hands of Castaneda and the witches. The members never knew where they stood in the group. They might be the golden child one day and called all kinds of bad names the next, and shown the door immediately afterwards. A lot of the good or bad treatment was decided by one inner circle member called the Blue Scout. If for whatever reason she decided she didn't like you, you were shown the door. When asked to describe the Blue Scout, one member said it was like an episode of The Twilight Zone called It's a Good Life. Billy Mooney played Anthony Fremont, a young boy with vast mental powers, but lacking emotional development. He holds his terrified family hostage to his every juvenile wish. You're a bad man. You're a very bad man. I bet some of y'all recognize that one. Just who was the Blue Scout? She started out as Patricia Parton. Once falling under Castaneda's spell, she refused to visit or talk to any of her family. She changed her name to Nuri Alexander, but she also went by the name Cloud. She was said to be other than human. She had magical insight, and so she was given carte blanche to decide the fates of others. When not making people's lives heaven or hell, as she was a full-time student studying anything that she found interesting, and she spent money like it was free. Castaneda convinced Parton that she was becoming a young girl, and then she became a child. New members would be told to play dolls with her. It was still a bad idea to make her mad. You didn't want to be called a bad man. She wasn't always a child. She was able to drive. Maybe she was just playing the part for unknown reasons. Maybe it was fun. When's the last time you played with anything? I play with my cats. In the late 80s, Castaneda told followers that the Blue Scout had talked him into starting Clear Green, a magical workshop for those wishing to fulfill their dreams. It is still in operation today. Castaneda investigated the possibility of incorporating as a religion So he developed tensegrity. Tensegrity is a movement technique that seems to combine elements of rigid version of Tai Chi and modern dance. The group would hold seminars at high schools and colleges. At tensegrity seminars, the women all dressed in black, and they were called the chakmols. They demonstrated moves for the audience. Castaneda and the witches would speak, and they would answer questions. Seminars would cost $1,200 per person, and there would be as many as 800 people at each event. That's a lot of green. Participants could buy T-shirts that said, "Self-importance kills, do tensegrity." The movements were meant to promote health as well as help practitioners progress as warriors. Illness was seen as a sign of weakness. Any member who was discovered to be sick would find themselves out of the group. The Orange Scout, supposedly the Blue Scout's sister, had ulcerative colitis. When it was no longer a secret, she was out on her butt in no time. In the 90s, Castaneda told his followers that just like Don Juan, he wasn't going to die. He said he would burn from within, turn into a ball of light, and ascend to the heavens. In the summer of 1997, Castaneda was diagnosed with liver cancer. Because sorcerers weren't supposed to get sick, his illness remained a tightly guarded secret. While the witches desperately pursued traditional and alternative treatments, the workshops continued as if nothing was wrong. Castaneda missed many gatherings so that his illness could be kept secret. He continued to decline. He became increasingly frail. His eyes turned yellow with jaundice. He rarely left his compound, kept getting worse until confined to bed on a morphine drip. The witches got busy burning all of his records. A few of the inner circle vanished. It is unknown if they wandered off on their own or maybe they were dealt with to keep the secrets safe. The women who starred in most of the Tensegrity films was one of the missing. April 1998, Gabby Gutierrez filmed The Inner Circle packing up the house. The next week, at age 72, Castaneda died. He was cremated at the Culver City mortuary, but nobody knows what they did with the ashes. Within days, the witches Donner Grau, Abelair, Parton, and Marquez had their phones disconnected and they all vanished. A few weeks later, Blue Scout, or Parton's red Ford Escort, was found abandoned in Death Valley's Fremont Dunes. Within the inner circle, few knew that Castaneda was dead. The media didn't learn of his death for 2 months. When the news became public, Clear Green members stopped answering the phone. They soon placed a statement on their website. This is what it said, and I'm still wondering what it says. For Don Juan, the warrior, was a being who embarks, when the time comes, on a definitive journey of awareness, crossing over to total freedom. Warriors can keep their awareness, which is ordinarily relinquished at the moment of dying. At the moment of crossing, the body in its entirety is kindled with knowledge. Carlos Castaneda left the world the same way that his teacher Don Juan Matisse did, with full awareness. Now, some of that didn't make sense to me. The mystery of the missing women lingers on today. Many believe they may have committed suicide. Castaneda's will, executed 3 days before his death, left everything to the entity known as the Eagles Trust. The missing women have a considerable amount of money due to them. Castaneda had amassed a lot of money from his books and seminars. He used to talk about suicide all the time, even for minor things. A Blue Scout, Parton, was once sent out to identify abandoned mines out in the desert, which could be used as potential suicide sites. The final scene in Tales of Power, Carlos leaps from a cliff into the Nagual. The scene is later retold at various versions. In his 1984 book, The Fire from Within, Castaneda wrote, I didn't die at the bottom of that gorge, and neither did the other apprentices who had jumped at an earlier time, because we never reached it. All of us, under the impact of such a tremendous and incomprehensible act as jumping to our deaths, moved our assemblage points and assembled other worlds. On its website, Cleargreen maintains that the women did not disappear. For the moment, they are not going to appear personally at the workshops because they want this dream to take wings. What many find bizarre is there was no investigation into the women's disappearances. Having estranged themselves from friends and family, nobody was there to press the authorities to look. Just a rudimentary inquiry followed by an open file left on a desk somewhere. Castaneda has been acknowledged as an important influence by figures ranging from Deepak Chopra to George Lucas. Castaneda opened the doors of perception for numerous readers, and many workshop attendees found the experience deeply meaningful. There are those who testify to the benefits of tensegrity. Many of the members of Carlos Castaneda's following still insist he was a guru of sorts. They say his writings were all factual and his teachings should be kept alive despite all the bad press. Marshall Applewhite, the founder of Heaven's Gate, still has followers out there today. His website is still up and running. Members of Jim Jones' People's Temple were still on the streets years after Jonestown, preaching his philosophies. Carlos Castaneda and his books about Don Juan are still selling well. His religion, tensegrity, is still being taught at seminars. It's never a good idea to turn your life over to a person or organization. I know a lot of folks who have turned their lives over to Jesus or a higher power, but well, that's something different. That's not a person. Well, Jesus is more than a person. So, a higher power, that's a God or however you see your supreme being. But it's not a good idea to do it for any one person or any organization, especially when you're not really too sure if their teachings are legitimate or not. If a person starts out telling lies, how can you ever really believe what follows? Politicians somehow manage to keep getting elected no matter what they say and then do. They'll promise the moon and not even deliver a star. It's almost as if there is some kind of a cult following them, seeing to it that their chosen one is allowed to govern and ruin everybody's lives. A red flag should be if the person over you says, there are rules for thee, but not for me. I'm not trying to convince you that Carlos Castaneda was lying or deceiving anyone. I'm just giving out what I was able to find. It is your job to look at the facts and come to a conclusion on your own. For my take on him, I think just maybe the first book about Don Juan might have been written because A. He had contact with some spirit being that portrayed itself as being a Yaqui Indian. The ideas were passed on for some unknown reason, some alien agenda, perhaps. B, the whole thing was a drug-induced hallucination, and Carlos was able to make millions after his trip. C, maybe the first book was legit, but Carlos got caught up in all the attention and the praise being heaped on him, and he just winged it from then on, just coming up with new books every so often. I am no guru. I'm not here to tell others what to think or how to live your lives. I would like to think that some of y'all out there listen to what I say and then you use your own minds to come up with new and improved ideas. Never having met the man, I have to base my opinions on what others had to say. It's not a good way to do things, but after all, he's long dead, and it's about the only way I can do it. I'm not going to do a seance. I'm not going to use a Ouija board. So I have to rely on others. Wisdom comes from experience. Experience comes from making lots of bad decisions. I have made a lot of bad decisions, and I'm still not wise. I'm still working on those experiences. Think once, make some mistakes twice. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Thing.
Are you coming to the tree where there's strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.